Hey, Roland here. This week we're gonna release another What's Your Baseline shorts for you, just to lighten up our summer break a little bit. And this week's topic is why simulation should not be in your process mining tool. And I'm fully aware that this is a controversial thing, because people might think, well, it's convenient, have it in your process mining tool, do some what ifs and go on and move on. But I honestly think it's a bad decision, because you're limited to your process mining data. And hand on heart, how many processes have you mined in your organization? So without further ado, have fun with this week's What's Your Baseline shorts. See you next week.
Hey folks, welcome to this week's What's Your Baseline shorts. I'm Jay Ameronson, process and architecture expert, and I'm excited to be joined with Roland Volts, who is going to tell us a little bit more about simulation today. Roland, why don't you introduce yourself first, and then we'll tackle today's topic, simulation.
Sure. Hi, I'm Roland. I'm the guy who had the idea for all those shenanigans, and obviously you can look at my bio if you want to see more details on that.
Wonderful. Well, then let's talk about today's topic, because this is really What's Your Baseline shorts, the shortened version of our hour-long podcast you can find on what'syourbaseline.com. But today we're talking about simulation. Now, it's a question a lot of people have for us. How do I do something with the information from my process? And Roland, let's tell them more about what that means from a simulation perspective.
Oh, well, I think simulation is more the idea of that you can create futures, plural, in your tools and simulate, quote unquote, what would be the outcome. Or to say it in other words, you have a process and you change parameters on it, and then you see what the different outcomes will be, with the idea that you will then pick, obviously, the most advantageous. And you use that for your implementation.
Well, it's also, there's another element of simulation that I really find important, which is future proofing. So simulation is very good at creating those what if scenarios. So a bunch of what if I change this thing? What would be my business value? So as you might imagine, that's used a lot for things like project justification. Say if I were to only change these three things at the cost of a total cost of $2 million, I could save us $1 million a year, like a huge amount of value, right? But the other thing is that I've got a process today that's run, 5,000 times a week. What if tomorrow this became a core process for the company and it was run 25,000 times a week, or 100,000 times a week, or 1 million times a week? Where would it break first? And so simulation can also be used to future-proof processes. So I feel like that's a really important thing that people often overlook when they're first thinking about the use case for simulation. But man, I have clients who are leveraging that today to do a lot of really good things.
And you open a can of worms with that, because simulation in itself is obviously not, well, it is a thing, but it's not a standalone thing. So typically it's embedded in what I like to call the solution lifecycle, right? Where you have some high level analysis and you might use simulation there, as you described. What happens if we go 20,000 times a day, right? Or you go to the next step where you say, oh yeah, I'm designing a future state for whatever, a system implementation, for a reorg, for a process improvement, right? And you want to figure out what's the most advantageous there. And then it goes through implementation and the execution. And then some vendors say, hey, we're going to have that in our process mining tool, which is the measure phase. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. But JM, tell me a little bit about what does a simulation do, or what do you have to put in to get a meaningful simulation outcome?
That's a really good question. And I mean, there's kind of a minimum viable product, right? You need to have a demand model. So how much are you asking? You need to have a process model, which is how does it work? And you need to have some factor of time and flow to help you to understand how long each step takes. And that could be formulas. So you could have like a normal curve with, the parameters defined about each step. Or you can simply have flat numbers like average times. And then you need to have routing numbers, as in what percentage of the time does it go down path A versus path B, so that I can see how often it ends up in my different flow scenarios. And so demand, time, and routing. That's really the basic level.
I think there's a fourth one that you should put in, which is resources. Typically human resources, right? How many people do this?
I hope you do, but you don't have to. But it does a lot of good for you if you do.
Good simulation tools allow you to simulate machines.
Yeah.
Right. Think about some IoT thing, or think about a manufacturing line, where obviously rechanging the jig in the machine for the different next piece that you want to do is obviously also time consuming.
Oh
It's the
yeah.
dynamic wait time and all these type of things.
Well, if you want to
But
get really down into it, you can even do things like simulating physical resources. So I can have like a
yeah.
hopper with a certain number of widgets in it, and then it can track how often this process draws down on the hopper and how often replenishment comes to fill up my hopper again. And so you can
Mhm.
see like those resources are what we use very heavily to find bottlenecks. Because
Mhm.
oftentimes that's where you're going to find the most opportunity for improvement in terms of rebalancing loads and taking a look at future proofing what demand will require in terms of resources on your side. Because for instance, if you're looking at a team of like 20 people, you got them in 5 different roles. We don't have 4 people in each role. What you actually have is like 2 people in this role, 6 people in that role, and 7 people in this role, and 1 person in this role. If you switch around the resources, you could load balance the work that's being done much better.
Mhm.
Or if you switched around which resource is doing which task, you can much better adapt for who you have to be able to make sure your process works better. So resourcing is a great way of understanding bottlenecks, and then it gives you a really good way of helping to optimize around who you have.
So what is the outcome then of the simulation? Is
Well,
it just a
yeah.
picture, or what do you get?
So
You put all that effort
ideally,
in there.
yeah, ideally, there's a few different outcomes of simulation. Ideally, a simulation is going to tell you or suggest to you possible paths for success based off your criteria. So
How?
a perfect
How
example
is
is
that?
it's going
Is
to
that a
pick
little
out.
person? Is
Yeah,
that a little person in there that whispers in your
yeah,
ear and
no,
says,
no, no.
"Jam, you should
There's
do
a few
this"?
different.
Or how,
Yeah, yeah.
what do you have?
There's a few things. So number one is a lot of good simulation tools will write onto your process steps different numbers about how they performed under the simulated conditions. You can use that to throw up dashboards to understand and highlight where bottlenecks are, where issues are coming up in your process, where things are needy or greedy process steps. So you can say, okay, so I'm going to highlight the things in in a bar chart. These 3
Hmm.
things are my biggest problems. If I were to change 3 things in this process, I suspect these would have the highest impact. The other thing
Hmm.
simulation can kick out for you is statistical files, things like Excel files with a bunch of scenarios laid out, and even scored scenarios. So we take a look at like optimization. You can score the combination of parameters that you can control to say this one has the highest net value to me. And so we have like a weighting system on like each different parameter, like how much do I care about how long people are waiting versus how much do I care about how much money I'm spending on human resources. Like those are things you can weigh against each other. And you can kick an Excel file, or some tools have an in-tool
Hmm.
analysis for that. They often have a visualization that you can watch, sort of simulate through and even step through to see, okay, so I have a problem here. It's an outlier condition. What happened? And let me watch back to be able to understand how I have to adapt.
So that sounds super geeky to me, which is one thing
It
that we're
kind of
going to talk
is.
about when we talk about the different ways of doing this. But I want to
Yeah.
push that a little bit out for a minute or so. But I think the first takeaway is, you as the potential simulation user
Hmm.
should have a hypothesis. You should know what you're looking for. Are you interested in bottlenecks?
Yeah.
How are your bottlenecks being defined? Is it just the step that takes too long? Or is it the step that builds up a backlog and therefore it's too long because you bind resources for this?
Right.
So, or are you looking for the utilization, the age-old question: how many people do I need to do this job?
Yeah.
So come up with an idea what your problem is that you're looking at.
The other
Right. So
thing you can
that's the
do,
first takeaway.
even without necessarily having a hypothesis, one of the things we haven't talked about a little bit yet is cost. A lot of
Mhm.
organizations are trying to drive towards minimum of cost. So it's not actually just a hypothesis; it's also like a goal in mind. Like, what are you trying to get
Yeah.
to?
Where can I save?
Exactly. So
Or
so
all the.
the
Mhm.
only way you can get a savings model, and I actually did this with a major technology company in the Southwest. They said we have an external system that we're using that is owned by a third party, and every time we use that system, it costs us money. How do we
Mhm.
make sure that we use it only when necessary? So how do I have to
Yeah.
reallocate resources? How can I re-engineer my process, change around the steps that I'm actually doing, so that we hit the system less with the same number of people? And so cost was a huge factor. So you have to include cost of steps. So how much does a thing cost if it's an
Mhm.
external step? or how much do our resources cost, and then how long are those resources taking, so we can do a human resource cost. How much do our internal resources or our internal like services cost? So if you're looking at a chargeback or a showback scenario with one of your other business units or IT who's providing the service to you, and we can do a pretty detailed analysis on where those costs are coming from, and then be able to minimize around that. That could be instead of a hypothesis, that could be kind of a goal.
Makes sense. Even though I would put it in the same bucket, figure out what you want to know.
Yeah.
I think the second takeaway that you have is you can take that output, right? So the MSAT, you get bar charts and pie charts and all that type of stuff. You obviously could export it. And I'm pretty sure if you have some lean person in your organization, they will be your best buddies.
Oh, yeah.
Because then they can use this for their additional statistical analysis that is a little bit over the head for me models like myself.
Well, yeah, I know things like MATLAB are really good for plotting statistical curves, and like you can really get down first and foremost.
If you go down the whole Six Sigma rabbit hole, yes.
The statisticians out there, we love you. No disrespect, but on this podcast, we're saying a little bit less complicated than what you're doing. But thank you for doing what you do.
So the third takeaway, and this is what I pushed out a minute ago, is you need to understand what type of simulation you have. And what I see is typically three types, right? So the first type is what's called discrete event simulation. And that's basically, I would say, brute forcing the simulation engine to do things. So if you say you have a process and it runs 300 times a day, and it has so many resources and so many steps, and each step takes so long, and when you come to a branch, 80% go this way, 20% go this way, this type of stuff. It literally creates 300 instances. And it runs those 300 instances obviously much faster than a human would do this, right? And it goes through and then creates those statistics while observing those parameters that we have. Right. This gives you the tightest control, right? Because you can trace down each individual instance. You can say, oh, yeah, this is how this instance went, and the other one went a different path, right? Similar to what you see in process mining.
And this is really handy when you have the statistical distribution of things on each step. So if I have a normal curve on that step.
That's different. That's different. That's the second takeaway. That's the Monte Carlo simulation, right? Where you go and you have probabilities, and you throw individual samples on it. And if you do that often enough, you obviously have the biggest enough population to come to a similar result.
Well, Monte Carlo also relies on varying parameters. Like Monte Carlo, you wouldn't run the same simulation exactly as is even with the statistical things. You would also change the numbers in it each time you run it.
Yep.
So what discrete event simulation will give you is sort of how the process performed in all of its different ways it could have gone. Monte Carlo will say all of the different ways it could have gone multiplied by all the different configurations of the process equals all this huge chart of possibility. And that's when we do the scoring as a Monte Carlo style simulation, is when we go, okay, what combination of parameters led to the best outcomes?
Which means it's faster because it's just math, and computers are good in math.
Yes, they
are.
So,
but you have less control, if you will. It's not the brute force attempt. The third one is, and this is, the whole beef that you and I have about this topic is when you see tool vendors that say, oh, we have simulation in our tool.
The meat of this conversation is
tool, particularly at 12 minutes, 12 minutes 44.
It's particularly vendors in process mining. They will tell you they have simulation.
Yeah, and I think that the problem with that is, so what they do is, and I like to say it, and don't want to diss on anyone there, call it whatever you want, but it's more like a glorified what if, because in process mining, everything is based on the data set that you pulled, right, from your runtime systems, which is basically your as-is information. So what you can do now is, in these simulations, is you can play with parameters. What happens if we had twice as many, or these type of things, right? But it's always based on the data set. So what you're missing when we think about the solution lifecycle that I just described before, what happens if you want to throw out your whole process and do something completely different as part of your solution design? You can't.
You're screwed.
Right? And that is, I think, the biggest thing, the biggest beef that I have with process mining, where people say, oh yeah, we have our simulation in the process mining tool.
Yeah, and the process mining can inform the steps
yeah.
of your process for simulation. That's a good thing. Having process
Yeah.
mining as a data source, but process mining isn't the workplace. It's the data
That's true.
source. And when you start
That's
to
true.
take that have that mental shift of like, I can do everything in this one space, like you can, but you are limited, extremely limited on the choices you can make. We had a colleague we used to work with who used to say, if I only have, or if it takes me a lot of work to do something, I only present 1 or 2 choices. But when I present 5 or 6 choices, because I've got a lot more flexibility because of the tool I've chosen, I'm more likely to come to a better solution.
So let's
So,
come to the end of
yes.
this wonderful What's Your Baseline shorts. What were the takeaways? Number 1, JM, come on.
Number one is that simulation is something that you should be looking at from 3 different perspectives: parameter variation, from flow variation, and from optimization of conditions.
Number 2 would be have an idea what you're looking for, right?
Yep.
Just don't start out in the blue. And number 3, JM, is what?
Is that your process mining tools are not your simulation tools. They're a good feeder, but they are not a replacement. And so, ladies and gentlemen,
nicely said.
it's been a pleasure as always. I'm J.M. Erlinson.
And I'm Roland Volt.
And we will see you
And we're
in the
going to
next
see
one.
you in the next one.